Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and what follows is an excerpted clip from one of my longer webinars. So what I've decided is that sometimes when people ask really interesting questions, I will pull out that particular part of a webinar and make it available to you as a short clip so that if you don't have time to watch a 1-hour webinar, you can at least watch and listen to the brief exchanges that I usually have with people who attend my webinars. So here is one such clip from a recent webinar. I hope you enjoy it. What happens to you if you live in a colonial situation which is violent? That violence will then impact you. And so in order to cure anyone of paranoia or other mental ailments, you can't just do it clinically in a hospital. You must change the system itself that is causing that psychological trauma. So that is the basic argument in The Wretched of the Earth. So then when he goes on to explain violence, right, what his idea, and this is where a lot of people indict Fanon for being the philosopher of violence, but they never really understand that what he's talking about is within the context of colonial violence and psychoanalysis or psychology. So what he's saying is, in the beginning part of the book, he's tracing the desire of the native subject and its suppression, right? That, first of all, the male subject who's in the public sphere is emasculated by the European law, is told to stay in his place. And right in front of his eyes is a community that is created. It has order, beautiful boulevards and all. So you have created a place of desire which this person cannot have. And then you have violently told this person, this is your place in society. And that order is maintained through violence, right? So in terms of the psyche, that place across the street from the Kasbah becomes the place of desire. And if you can convince yourself that that was your land, your place, right, then the desire to oust those who have it and replace them with yourself is ultimately a psychological desire, which will be generated in this subject. Now, since the colonial system, according to Fanon, is a violent system, relies on brutality, police and others to keep the natives in check, the only way psychologically for these men to claim their full humanity is to literally overthrow their masters, right? To evict them from that land. That is why when you read his essay concerning violence, that is what it's talking about. Not necessarily that we must be violent, but that if you really want to see this human psyche which has been suppressed and which causes trauma and which has been violated through violence, the only way out of it is by overthrowing the people who have done that. And that is the project of The Wretched of the Earth, right? So as I said, by this time, he was already part of the FLN. And he was already involved in the most radical part of the FLN. Now, do also keep in mind that the Algerian freedom movement was one of the most brutal wars of independence that was fought. Okay, so the French unleashed their entire military force and special services to, suppress the uprising. About 2 million people died in that. Okay. And then at the end, after the Pied Noir, the French settlers leave. Okay, they don't just leave, they burn everything that they had built, the hospitals, the schools, the infrastructure. They completely destroy it to a point that the Algerians have to pretty much rebuild the infrastructure. And so Algerian freedom movement was also interesting because part of it was leftist, but they also mobilized, a purist religious identity, of course, which comes to haunt them afterwards in the place of women in that, even though women actively participated in the struggle. But that's the backdrop in which The Wretched of the Earth has been written. Now, a cautionary note, when you use your Fanon, right, know the difference. Are you quoting early Fanon? If you are, then mention it there, that you are aware that the Fanon of the wretched of the earth is on a different trajectory, still dealing with the psyche, but also involved in a liberation struggle. So that's the distinction between the two books. Okay, so these are like some of my ideas about Fanon. And then one of the essays chapters that I really teach from The Wretched of the Earth is the Fanon's speech and his two chapters, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness and On National Culture. And the one on national culture is a more developed version, but it's also important to read this essay, especially if you want to discuss the debates of nationalism. Now, this chapter, of course, was written in response to the negritude movement, which was led by people like Damas and Senor and others. Now, what the negritude movement people believed in was that Africa should become independent and then it should become United States of Africa. They were Pan-Africanists. What Fanon is arguing here is that, yes, we can be that later, but first we must develop national consciousness, because he sees that as a prerequisite to building larger alliances. And Fanon is also not culturalist, whereas most of the negritude movement people were culturalists. So what Fanon is suggesting here is that how does the national consciousness emerge? So he gives 3 stages of national consciousness and mobilization. The first stage is when the native elite learn the languages of their masters and start producing works in the languages of their masters, right, which are European in nature, use the European tropes and forms, right? In the second stage, the native writers and artists turn to their own culture and start retrieving their own art forms, clay, working with stones, writing. And then in the third stage, which is the stage before the rise of national movements, is when the native authors, in Fanon's word, express the heart of the people, right? That is when they start writing the literature of combat. And that literature is mostly either in native languages, and it exhorts the people to fight for their rights. So these are the 3 stages which are very important in understanding how Fanon articulates it, because if you're doing post-colonial work and you want to place what stage of evolution, let's say, a certain book is, you can go back to Fanon and cite him and bring about, if R.K. Narayan is writing, which stage of native production it is. And then what is the combat literature? How is it produced? How it is perpetuated? Concerning violence, that is the most important part of the book, right? What he does in this chapter concerning violence, which is a great explanation of how a violent system is established, right? And the good thing about Fanon is that he's not just giving us the material causes of how a system of violence, of colonial violence, is established, but he also is giving us the psychological trauma caused by it. What does it do, right? And then how to respond to it. Like here is a sentence: the natives are convinced that their fate is in the balance here and now. They live in the atmosphere of doomsday, and they consider that nothing ought to be let pass unnoticed. That is why they understand very well. And then he goes, like, basically what he's giving us is not just an historical account or even a theoretical account, but also what happens in a violent system psychologically, even though if it is an economic violence or military violence. And what does it do to the psyche of those who are either fighting against it or are living in that situation, right? So that's why concerning violence to me is kind of the heart of the book. If you read it carefully, It will give you a lot of insights into the psychological aspects of violence or a violent political system, along with how it is established and how does it work. So let's say if you wanted to write about not just post-colonialism, if you just wanted to write about epistemic violence in any given society, post-colonial society, what does it do to women's consciousness, right? You could read concerning violence because it gives you the key into explaining what a violent situation may it be physical violence or epistemic violence. What kind of subjectivities does it create? What is the subjectivity of the so-called victim, and what would it take for that victim, through solidarity with others, to fight back and claim their full humanity? Now, I always also encourage my students to read Fanon along with Paulo Freire, because Freire is also talking about revolution, and a kind of revolution that creates equal human beings. His method is through didactics, through teaching. But one thing that we learn from Fanon, from Freire, is this idea is how to create a revolutionary subjectivity that is freedom-loving, but that does not become oppressor when it has won the freedom, right? And that's a question that Fanon doesn't really answer. But this is how we read one work and see how it infuses another, or how we can bring them into conversation. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this brief clip. If you are interested in the longer version, the link will be in the description and you can watch the whole webinar. Thank you so much for your support. And as always, if you have any questions, any concerns, you can always post them in the comments and I'll be happy to respond to them. If you have a moment and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so now so that you get timely notifications of whatever is happening on this channel. Thank you for your support. Stay safe, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.